You're listening to Despair by Michael Brockbank. Episode 18. Although Magarius was discouraged to hear that the townsfolk had never seen the artifact, it didn't dissuade him from continuing his research. The last shift from the old body and into that of Bernard took much longer than he would have liked. There were times when, as Darius would put it, body hopping would take a considerable amount of time. But in those cases, it was because there was a lack of corpse nearby. The lich could only seize the dead if they were within close proximity of the phylactery. Normally, he would keep several bodies in nearby crypts. Unfortunately, decomposition makes for a difficult transition at times, not to mention a rancid appearance. As he often explored outside the confines of his shelter, the lich had no interest in looking like a decrepit mess. His goal was to find a way to immortalize the flesh he inhabited. Although he was able to take full control over the fallen, the rate of decomposition continued. Magarius was close to finding a way to sustain the dead flesh for longer periods of time before a stalwart wizard intervened. Much to his dismay, the lich's mastery of necromancy and the power he wielded was not merely enough to accomplish his goals. The body of the once healthy man laid before him on the stone makeshift table. Candles and runes encircled the body in a form of ritual where magic meets science. The limbs were stacked neatly next to one side. The man's chest had been cut open and his face frozen in frightful terror as his life drained away. Magarius stared at the corpse, still unable to wrap his mind around how to keep the body animated without decomposition. After several centuries and thousands upon thousands of attempts, he was no closer to finding the answer, at least not without the artifact. Since the teleportation from Galen's basement, the lich found his research far less revealing than before. Unable to rely on his previous notes and the many books he had at his disposal, Magarius had to start over from the very beginning. Unlike his previous domain, these new lands seemed void of anything necromantic in nature. Even some of his spells and abilities seemed twisted in some fashion. He had no doubt that he would have found the answer by then if he were back in his kingdom. That is, as long as he had the artifact in hand. Using a quill, he jotted down notes in a book while drawing diagrams of the experiment in question. Without having reference points from which to work, he had to rely on his own. This meant essentially creating his own library of necromancy. A part of him rather liked the idea of being a pioneer in the dark arts in this strange land, though he highly doubted anyone other than himself would have the pleasure of reading his books. "You probably should have kept that one," Magarius said to himself, glancing up and down the body. The man was in far better physical condition than Bernard. Although he had plans for his current form, the lich couldn't help but wonder if he should have sustained this figure for a bit longer and then switched bodies. "It probably would have lasted you longer," Darius spoke, entering the stone chamber. He was carrying a large traveling bag slung over his shoulder. "What?" Magarius asked himself as the burly man's voice snapped him out of his fixation on the body. "Ah, yes, it's about that time, isn't it? The ship should arrive soon after we do," Darius replied, looking over at the body. It began to twitch and wiggle about. Magarius looked back at the dismembered core of the man. It took much longer to animate than any of his previous attempts. "Well, that didn't work," he said in a disappointed tone. He feared that without his original lab, or the artifact, achieving his objectives would be next to impossible. The lich reached out his fingers and muttered a quick phrase. A green spark of energy flew from his fingertips and struck the body of the man. The flesh briefly emitted a faint green light, which soon dissipated. What remained of the man fell motionless. "Do you think the shipment of witch wood would help?" Darius asked, lowering the traveling bag to the floor. "In Yarkspur, yes. Witcham? Absolutely. Here, I have no idea. It almost seems like the balance of power is in disarray in these lands. In some ways, I am more powerful than I have been in the past. In others, it feels as though the fabric of the supernatural is torn. I still don't have as much faith in that little witch as you have," Darius said, approaching the table. He was preparing to gather up the remaining pieces of the body to dispose of them down what they called the pit. It was a deep borehole leading into a sealed cavern where the two have spent many years tossing remnants of failed experiments. I know you don't, my old friend, but you need to trust that we're on the right track. So far, her foresight has been immaculate. Or perhaps it was all coincidental. The burly man replied, hoisting the torso over one shoulder and gathering the limbs with his other hand. Perhaps, but you can't ignore the fact that she foresaw the cliff, village, and our current situation. There was one other fact that the seer told Magarius that he had no intention of telling his servant. His demise. Standing at the base of the cliff, Magarius began putting on his black leather gloves. It was more ritual than practical, as he felt no pain nor needed to protect his hands. However, the coverings helped hide his true visage once a body he inhabited started to decompose. For as long as he could remember, though, he always wore gloves when he traveled out in the open. To do so otherwise would make him feel naked. Why don't you just teleport us to the outskirts of town? It would save a lot of time walking, Darius grumbled as he hoisted the traveling bag over his shoulder. Because I don't have an exact sense of where we would appear. I doubt you'd like to find yourself halfway stuck in a tree, the lich replied, walking towards the dense tree line. You were able to pull the townsfolk, and it exhausted every bit of power I had to make sure each one had his and her own cells. It's quite a delicate process, my friend. Teleportation was one of those abilities that drained his power, especially in this new land. Without knowing an exact location, Magarius couldn't guarantee where the duo would reappear. The last time he tried a long-distance teleportation spell for himself and his traveling companion, the two found themselves in the middle of a pig pen. While it gave his servant a chance to slaughter a few for the walk home, the lich found the experience indignant. It was roughly a 2-day walk to the town from the cliff, not too far to make it a full-on adventure, but not close enough as to attract unsuspecting visitors. Although Magarius needed no rest, his flesh and blood companion needed to make brief stops along the way. Still, for any normal humanoid, the trek would more than likely have taken 4 days in total. During the journey, neither spoke much. Then again, once you've been traveling with someone for a century or so, everything that could have been said has been said. That was aside from the fact that Darius didn't talk much. Out of all the companions Magarius had over the years, his most recent servant was the quietest. That wasn't always a bad thing, though. He remembered one in particular who made her opinions known quite often. She was a handful, to say the least. Although Magarius found her beauty striking, there were times when he contemplated getting rid of her and finding a new lycanthrope. By the end of the second day, Magarius and his companion arrived at Welshire. It wouldn't be long until the lich could retrieve his shipment of witchwood to continue his experiments on the remaining townsfolk.